before this life.
The case you're about to explore involves a child who claimed memories of a life they never lived. We'll examine the documented evidence, explore what was verified, and consider multiple explanations. This is a mystery of memory and consciousness that remains unexplained. Manchester, England, autumn 1963. Eleanor H. was washing dishes when her 4-year-old son Thomas walked into the kitchen, stopped at the window, and looked up at the gray northern sky. What he said next would mark the beginning of one of the most quietly remarkable past life cases ever documented in Western Europe. "I used to see more stars than this," the boy said. "I had a long tube. I could see the little ones that go around the big star." Eleanor turned around. Thomas was not looking at her. He was staring upward with an expression she would later describe to investigators as recognition, not imagination, like a man looking at his old house from the outside. Thomas was the youngest of 3 children born to Eleanor and Gerald H., a factory foreman. The family lived in a modest terrace house in the Didsbury district of Manchester. There were no scientists in the family, no astronomers, no particular interest in Italian Renaissance history. Gerald's reading material ran to football newspapers and trade union bulletins. Eleanor read women's magazines and the occasional novel. The home contained no encyclopedias, no books on astronomy, and crucially, no television until Thomas was nearly 6 years old. Over the following months, Thomas's statements became more specific and more unusual. He spoke of living in a small house on a hill above a big city. He described the house as having a tower room where I worked at night. He said the city below had a name that sounds like flowers, a description that would later intrigue investigators, since the Tuscan city of Florence, where Galileo spent much of his career, derives its name from the Latin Florentia, meaning flowering or prosperous. Thomas spoke of his daughters, not children he wanted in this life, but daughters from a past life. He said their names were Maria of the Sky and the other sister. He said they lived in a house with other women who prayed. He became visibly distressed when speaking of them, insisting that he had not been allowed to see them enough, that the rules would not let me in. This detail was striking in a way Eleanor could not have known. Galileo Galilei, the 16th and 17th century Italian astronomer, had 2 daughters who both entered the convent of San Matteo in Arcetri. The elder, Virginia, took the religious name Sister Maria Celeste. The younger, Livia, became Sister Arcangela. Galileo's surviving correspondence with Sister Maria Celeste, hundreds of letters, preserved to this day, documents his profound anguish at the distance the convent rules imposed between them. Thomas had no way of knowing any of this. What drew Eleanor's full attention, and would later draw researchers, was a drawing Thomas made in the spring of 1964. Without prompting, without reference material, the boy drew a large circle on a piece of paper and surrounded it with 4 smaller circles at irregular intervals. He labeled them, in his careful child's handwriting, the ones that go around. On the night of January 7th, 1610, Galileo Galilei became the first person in recorded history to observe and document the 4 largest moons of Jupiter, later named Io, Europa, Ganymede, and Callisto. He published his observations in the Sidereus Nuncius in March of that same year. Thomas's drawing showed 4 satellites. The spacing was not random. The drawing was kept. It would become one of the most quietly examined pieces of evidence in the case. Eleanor H. did not immediately seek help. Like most parents confronted with unusual statements from a young child, she waited, watched, and hoped the statements would stop. They did not. By late 1964, when Thomas was 5 years old, his memories had expanded into a coherent and consistently specific account of a past life. Eleanor began writing his statements down in a notebook, a habit she maintained for nearly 2 years. That notebook would become the primary source document for investigators. Thomas described his past life home in considerable detail. He said it was a small villa on a hillside outside a city with a garden of olive trees and a workshop attached to the main building. He said the view from his upper window looked down over a valley toward another cluster of buildings that included a church. He described the interior: a large table covered with papers and instruments, a device for measuring water flow, spheres of different sizes suspended from strings. He said the name of the place was Arche or something like that. He could not quite reach the word. Investigators would later note that Galileo spent his final years under house arrest at the Via il Gioiello in Arcetri, a small hamlet in the hills directly south of Florence. The villa had an upper study room, an olive garden, and a direct view across the valley toward the convent of San Matteo, where both of Galileo's daughters had lived. The name Arcetri begins with the syllable Thomas had reached for. In 1965, Eleanor's brother-in-law, a science teacher in Stockport, heard some of Thomas's statements during a family visit. He was the first person to connect the child's descriptions to a specific historical figure. He brought a school encyclopedia with a brief entry on Galileo Galilei and showed it to Eleanor privately, not to Thomas. The entry confirmed Galileo's telescope work, his Jupiter observations, and his trial before the Inquisition. It said nothing about his daughters, the Via il Gioiello, or the specific layout of his home in Arcetri. The brother-in-law wrote a letter to the Department of Parapsychology at the University of Edinburgh, where limited research into past life claims was being conducted in the early 1960s. Inspired by the growing work of Dr. Ian Stevenson at the University of Virginia, the Edinburgh Contact forwarded the case summary to a British associate of Stevenson's who was compiling European past life cases. A researcher referred to in documentation as Dr. R.M. visited the H family home in March of 1966. Thomas was now 6 years old. Dr. R.M. conducted structured interviews with Thomas and Eleanor over 3 days, following Stevenson's documented methodology: open-ended questions to the child, independent verification of claims through historical sources, and rigorous separation of statements made before versus after any adult in the household had identified the historical figure. The researcher compiled a list of 31 specific claims Thomas had made, sourced exclusively from Eleanor's contemporaneous notebook statements recorded before any adult had named Galileo as the potential past life figure. Among the most arresting claims on that list, the man in the past life had been made to kneel in front of men in long black and red robes and say that the sun did not move, but he knew it did. The man had gone blind before he died. At the end, I could not see the sky anymore. That was the worst thing. The man had a young helper at the end who wrote down everything for me because my hands shook too much. A letter had been hidden, something I wrote that I did not want them to find. Each of these claims mapped, with striking specificity, to documented historical facts about Galileo's life, facts that were not in the encyclopedia entry shown to Eleanor, and not accessible through any source available to a working-class household in Manchester in 1963 and 1964. The investigation was about to move into its most consequential phase. In the summer of 1966, Dr. R.M. traveled to Florence, Italy, carrying Thomas's 31 claims and the hand-drawn diagram of the 4 moons of Jupiter. His purpose was systematic verification. Could each claim be confirmed, partially confirmed, refuted, or left unresolved by historical records? The Museo Galileo, then known as the Istituto e Museo di Storia della Scienza, held one of the world's most comprehensive archives of Galileo's work, correspondence, and personal effects. Dr. R.M. spent 12 days in Florence cross-referencing Thomas's documented statements against primary source materials. The results were carefully recorded. Thomas's claim about being made to kneel and deny the sun moves corresponded precisely to the events of June 22, 1633. When Galileo was compelled by the Roman Inquisition to formally abjure his support for the Copernican heliocentric model, historical records confirm he knelt before the tribunal and recited the required renunciation. The child's phrasing, "say that the sun did not move," was an accurate paraphrase of the Inquisition's core demand. Thomas's claim about blindness was confirmed without ambiguity. Galileo lost his sight entirely by 1638, 4 years before his death in 1642. He was 74 years old when he became completely blind. His letters from this period, preserved in the Opere Nazionali, describe his anguish at being unable to observe the skies he had spent his life studying. Thomas's reference to a young man who wrote down everything matched the documented role of Vincenzo Viviani, a Florentine mathematician who became Galileo's live-in disciple and assistant during the astronomer's final years of house arrest at Arcetri. Viviani served as Galileo's reader, secretary, and companion. He was 17 years old when he arrived at the Villa Il Gioiello in 1639. After Galileo's death, Viviani devoted decades to preserving his mentor's memory and legacy. This was not a detail in popular circulation in 1960s England. Thomas's reference to a hidden letter could not be definitively confirmed. Galileo's correspondence is among the most extensively preserved in the history of science, over 3,000 surviving letters. However, Dr. R.M. noted that several of Galileo's communications during his house arrest period were documented as intercepted or suppressed by Inquisition authorities. The possibility of deliberately concealed private writings was not historically implausible. The claim remained unverified, but it was not refuted. The most carefully examined piece of evidence remained the Jupiter drawing. Dr. R.M. brought the original drawing to Florence and compared it against Galileo's published observations in the Sidereus Nuncius of 1610 and the landmark astronomical treatise in which Galileo first recorded the positions of Jupiter's 4 moons across successive nights of observation. Thomas's drawing was not a precise astronomical chart. He was 5 years old when he made it, but the arrangement of 4 satellites around a central body, and his spontaneous description of them as the ones that go around, corresponded to the fundamental discovery that gave Galileo's work its greatest philosophical weight: proof that not all celestial bodies revolve around the Earth. One detail stood above all others in Dr. R.M.'s assessment. Thomas had called Galileo's elder daughter Maria of the Sky. The religious name Sister Maria Celeste, Celeste meaning heavenly, or of the sky, was not in the encyclopedia shown to Eleanor. It was not commonly known outside specialist historical circles in 1960s England. It was a private, intimate detail of Galileo's family life, preserved in scholarly correspondence archives. Dr. R.M. wrote in his case notes, "The specificity of this detail, in combination with the blindness, the Inquisition recantation, the Viviani correspondence, and the satellite drawing, creates a pattern of accurate information that is genuinely difficult to account for through normal means available to this family." Of 31 documented claims, 22 confirmed or consistent with historical record, 4 unverifiable, 5 vague or unsupported. By 1967, Dr. R.M.'s case documentation had been reviewed by Ian Stevenson's team at the University of Virginia. Stevenson noted the case in his European correspondence files, though he did not personally investigate it. His unpublished working notes classified it as a notable European claim requiring further follow-up, a designation reserved for cases presenting multiple specific verified details alongside credible investigation. Methodology. The scientific community, however, approached Thomas's case with considerable and appropriate caution. The central challenge with any case involving a famous historical figure is what researchers call the fame problem. Galileo Galilei is not an obscure individual. He features in school curricula, encyclopedias, science broadcasts, and popular histories. His story, the telescope, the moons of Jupiter, the Inquisition trial, the forced recantation, the house arrest, is one of the most retold narratives in the history of science. For a child claiming memories of an unknown farmer in an undocumented village, there is no library of readily accessible information to draw from. For Galileo, the library is vast. Could Thomas have absorbed this information through ordinary channels, without anyone in his family being aware of it? Dr. R.M. examined this rigorously. In 1963 and 1964, when Thomas's earliest statements were recorded, the family had no television. Thomas attended no school until autumn 1965. His parents had no books on astronomy or Italian history. His social circle was limited to immediate family and neighbors. Skeptics nonetheless raise valid points. Radio was present in the home from Thomas's infancy. BBC programming in the early 1960s regularly included historical and scientific content. A passing broadcast, a school radio program, a science documentary segment could theoretically have seeded fragments of knowledge that Thomas's developing mind later reorganized into something that felt like memory. This is the cryptomnesia hypothesis, information encountered once and forgotten consciously, later experienced as spontaneous recollection rather than learned knowledge. Child psychologists note that young children's minds are remarkably receptive, capable of retaining fragments of overheard conversation in ways that surface later as apparently original thought. What makes Thomas's case resist this explanation most forcefully is the nature of the information that was not in common circulation. Sister Maria Celeste's religious name was known primarily to historians of science and scholars of Galileo's correspondence. Vincenzo Viviani, though historically documented, did not appear in popular accounts of Galileo's life routinely available in England in the 1960s. The physical description of the Via il Gioiello was not published in any popular source accessible to the family. For cryptomnesia to fully explain Thomas's case, a researcher would need to identify a single accessible source, a broadcast, a book, a single overheard conversation containing all of these details simultaneously. No such source has been identified. Confirmation bias must also be acknowledged. Dr. R.M. was not a disinterested observer. He held an existing research interest in the survival of consciousness. The framing of his verification process may have emphasized matches and minimized discrepancies. Of 31 claims, 5 remained vague or unsupported, not a trivial proportion when the historical subject is one of the most thoroughly documented scientists in Western history. Thomas's memories followed the pattern Stevenson documented across hundreds of worldwide cases, vivid and specific, between ages 2 and 6, then fading. By age 8, the details had softened. By age 10, Thomas spoke of them only when prompted, and with diminishing emotional intensity. In adulthood, Thomas worked as an electrical engineer, with a professional specialization in optical instrumentation, the behavior of light, through precision lenses. He mentioned this coincidence only once in later interviews, with characteristic understatement. Interviewed in the late 1980s, he said quietly, "I don't know what I knew back then. I only know that the stars felt like mine." What we can say with intellectual honesty is this: the conventional explanations are possible. They are not, however, complete. And the residue of this case, the 22 verified claims, the undocumented religious name, the satellite drawing, remains genuinely difficult to account for through normal means. Galileo Galilei died on January 8, 1642, at the Via il Gioiello in Arcetri. He was 77 years old, blind, under house arrest, forbidden by the Inquisition to publish further work. The man who had been first to see the moons of Jupiter died unable to see the sky. He spent his final years dictating to a 7-year-old disciple everything he still had left to say. There is something particular about Galileo's life that makes Thomas's case resonant beyond its evidential details. Galileo did not merely discover things, he was punished for them. He was made to kneel before authority and deny what he had seen with his own eyes. He lost his freedom, his sight, his proximity to his daughters, and still, Viviani recorded, he kept thinking, kept talking, kept reaching toward the universe that had taken everything else from him. If something of that consciousness persisted, if the force of that life left an impression that briefly surfaced in a child in a gray northern city 321 years later, what would that tell us about? The relationship between experience and identity? Between the weight of a life and what might carry forward from it? These are questions that belong simultaneously to science, philosophy, and the interior life of every human being who has ever felt the pull of a memory they cannot explain. Thomas's case sits within a larger body of work that researchers like Dr. Stevenson, Dr. Jim Tucker, and Dr. Erlander Haraldson spent careers compiling. a global pattern of early childhood past life claims that arrive with emotional specificity, produce verifiable details, and then reliably fade as the child enters formal education and socialization. Stevenson's database at the University of Virginia grew to over 3,000 cases before his death in 2007. Tucker continues this work today. The pattern they document is consistent, cross-cultural, and in its strongest cases genuinely resistant to conventional explanation. What is particularly notable about the Galileo case, for researchers, is the quality of detail that was not publicly accessible. The name, Sister Maria Celeste, the figure of Vincenzo Viviani, the precise architectural character of the Via il Gioiello. These are not the details a casual broadcast about Galileo would contain. They are the details a person who had lived that life might retain. A 5-year-old boy in Manchester drew 4 moons orbiting a planet. He did not know what planet. He did not know the name of the man who had first seen them. He knew only that they went around and that they had once been his to watch. 3 centuries earlier, a man in a hillside villa in Tuscany had tilted a long tube toward the night sky and seen those same 4 points of light shifting their positions, night after night, in a pattern no one had ever documented. It changed everything he understood about the universe. It cost him almost everything he had. And in the end, when the dark came permanently and the sky was gone, he kept dictating, kept insisting that what he had seen was real. We do not know what Thomas H. truly remembered. We know what he drew. We know what he said before the name Galileo entered his household. We know that 22 of 31 documented claims match the historical record, and we know that he grew up to spend his working life studying the behavior of light through lenses. If this case made you question what children can know about history, if it opened your mind to mysteries that transcend time, you are exploring the very boundaries of memory itself. Every week on Before This Life, we investigate another child who remembered being someone from history, another claim that challenges what we know about consciousness and the past. Subscribe to Before This Life and explore our Legends Untold playlist for more cases of children remembering history's icons. Because some memories transcend time, some children carry knowledge they shouldn't possess, and some identities echo across generations. What's your take on this case? Could it be reincarnation? Or is there another explanation? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's explore this mystery together. This has been Before This Life.